very good morning to you. I'm Howard Feldman. This is the Synthesis Podcast. And from time to time, we take a look and we meet with various interesting people. This morning, Ronnie Apteker is joining us for the podcast. He is a founder of Internet Solutions. He's a filmmaker. He's a storyteller. He is a person who goes on life's journey and records those journeys as he travels. The topic this morning is storytelling for CEOs. It's quite fascinating because storytelling has always been part of our history from biblical times onwards. We've used stories to capture historical incidents, but also to instruct. The stories of Little Red Riding Hood, all of our fables, in fact, and all of our storytelling is around, or a lot of it, certainly as children, is around instruction. We know that Little Red Riding Hood went off into the woods. She doesn't wear red for no reason. She's a woman. She's a young girl who's becoming a woman, red being the age of being womanhood, representing womanhood. Her mother warns her to stay on the path and not talk to men. And that is, of course, the instruction for life. If she doesn't listen, and if she doesn't do that, if she does wander off the path that the family has set on the way to grandma's house, she will bring death and she will bring destruction to the family. Of course, we know that Little Red Riding Hood does just that. Storytelling is part of our world. It is part of every day. Ronnie Apteker, good morning. How are you doing?
Hi, Howard. Thank you very much for having me, and good morning. And we're doing good. Setting into fatherhood. It was 2 weeks ago today the baby was born, and it's amazing how you go from theory to practice literally like in a second. It's like 0 to 100. There's no warm up. You've got 5. You told me, so you're a pro. But
I'd say my wife is a pro.
But it's going good. It's a good morning. He slept last night, in between waking up and feeding and pooing. But he sleeps, so he's quite peaceful.
Ronnie, just to get onto the subject, how important is storytelling in business? Because we generally think, or I think until fairly recently, we've thought that we could separate those two. Business is about business. It's not about stories.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually a great insight to start off with, because I think you're right. If you look at modern literature, there's been more attention paid to the idea of leaders and CEOs. Let's call them leaders, because like on film work, I'm the leader on a number of projects. We don't use the word CEO, but it's the same thing. Like a film venture is like a startup. You're creating a product from scratch, and the product is a story. And when you lead a team, especially like in the creative field, be it programming, because I find a lot of parallels between computer programs and filmmakers. It's a creative endeavor. To me, what synthesis does is creative work. I don't see it as packing boxes in a factory. It's a highly creative endeavor, and creativity and storytelling go hand in hand. So just to go back to the insight that you started with, there's definitely literature more and more in this last decade or two around business leaders and CEOs becoming better storytellers. And I think it's fundamentally goes hand in hand with leading, inspiring, motivating, persuading. It's much more engaging. It's much more powerful. It's much more, I think, what's the word? There's so many words. It's much more bonding. It's more meaningful.
And memorable as well.
Memorable. But there's more buy-in. That's it. There's more buy-in when people gravitate and build a team around a story, as opposed to, we've got to meet this number, we've got to chase this target.
Because then aren't they responding then not just on an intellectual level, but also on an emotional level?
Absolutely.
So they've connected with it. They've connected with the message on a number of...
And it sounds like a cliche. It really does. And it sounds like, it's like a bunch of blah, blah, blah. You're trying to motivate us. Absolutely. There's no denying it. But sometimes the story can be so good. And sometimes the storyteller, you got to give credit to the storyteller. Sometimes the storyteller can be so good that there really is buy-in, because you can give the same story to a very unengaging, very dull, let's say an aggressive asshole, and say, here's your story, go and motivate the troops. And he will go there, or she will go there and not connect with anyone. Not everyone is a storyteller. Not everybody can tell a joke.
Interesting.
I've seen a lot of people that try to tell a
I
joke.
can certainly, it's interesting. I consider myself fairly funny at times, but I cannot tell a joke. Absolutely, I have an absolute
I don't buy
inability.
that. I don't know you well, but I mean, you look funny.
No,
I mean, you look like someone who likes to
a lot
laugh.
of people say I look funny. That's why I'm on radio.
No, I get told I look funny. So, Ronnie, you always look like there's some prank coming. Like, you look like a happy person.
I think I'm very comfortable with my sense of humor. I think I'm particularly funny. I crack myself up at times. But I cannot tell a joke. I can't follow the...
But now, and the joke itself, the word joke, is key because people remember a good joke. Like people remember a good story. So let's just throw some examples of a couple of good business stories. The guy wrote the book about the purple cow and said that's remarkable. You know, when somebody says your product is remarkable, your work is remarkable, then you've done marketing. You know, you've made impacts. You know, there's all those anecdotal business stories around. Like, for example, how did Colgate-Palmolive sell more toothpaste? You know, back in the day, you know, they tried marketing and they tried 2 for 1, and then somebody said make the tube bigger, like by 1 millimeter, and people said, how did that work? Well, people started squeezing out more toothpaste. You know, you get all these kind of weird, like lateral thinking stories, and we remember them, like the story of Toyota. Toyota was trying to gain more market share back in Japan because I don't know if people are aware of this, but Toyota's biggest market is still Japan, not America or South Africa. It's actually back at home. And well, it used to be. My facts could be a bit out of date. When I heard the story was in the 90s, so maybe it was different then. A lot of my knowledge is a bit sitting in the 90s. So Toyota, this is a cool story, and people go, wow, I didn't know that. And there's hundreds of these stories, and we all remember them because they have like a punchline, you know. So they were trying to gain market share in Japan, and they tried things like free car radio, you know, free service, new tires, and it went up 1%, down 1%, the market share. And then they went to see Edward de Bono. There's a name I do remember, the lateral thinking guy. And he told them to buy up what's called NCP, the National Car Parks. And they bought up all these parking lots in Tokyo. And I've been to Tokyo. You can't park. It's a dense city. It's expensive when it comes to parking, like New York City. I don't know today, but because I think New York has got some vacancies. I've been watching YouTube videos while cleaning the baby and feeding and that. And I watched one last night about just New York emptying out, which is quite sad. I love New York. But I was in Tokyo, and you also noticed the density and the expensive parking. So they went and bought all these parking lots. And Edward de Bono told them to put up these signs that said Toyota's only. And the market share went up like 8 or 9%. Because there isn't a parking option in Tokyo. So if you didn't own a Toyota, you couldn't park it. And these are these, like, there's lots of these stories. There's I mean, I'll give you one more. One more story about the guy in Australia in, I think, the 60s, went to the Australian telecom. It was kind of like South Africa. There was one telco back in the day. Now there's Telstra, and there's a few telcos in Australia, but like 30, 40 years ago, there was one like Telkom. And he went to the telco and said, the incumbent, and said, I want to put like these tiki boxes. There's a word that some of the listeners might
I was going to say, that's a word. There's a blast from the past.
Payphone machines. Payphone machines. Right. Even that, probably, what is a payphone machine?
Why do you need a payphone?
So he went to the Australian telco 30, 40, 50 years ago and said, I want to put these tiki boxes, you know, all over bars and restaurants in Australia, and we'll split the revenue. So the telco said, no risk to us. This guy wants to do it, this entrepreneur. We split the revenue. Let's do it. So Howard puts up the money. I'm the telco. I get half the money. But what Howard discovered is they had, like in South Africa 30 years ago, the flat rate system. And then they changed it. So someone would go to a bar, make a call, and stay on the phone for half an hour, not feed the meter. And he then went back to the telco and said, wait, it's not working. We've got a problem. And they said to him, actually, you've got the problem. We're not ready to overhaul the system. It's a big expense. And he said, oh, I'm going to go out of business. I said, well, that was your risk. So what he did is he put like 5 kilos of lead in every handset. And the revenues went up because after talking to Howard for a couple of minutes, he said, I've got to go.
Awesome. What a
But you see, and there's lots of these stories. If you start to go like on entrepreneur courses, and I'm sure you've been on some, and marketing courses and leadership courses, everyone's got a couple of gems in the cupboard. Like I've got a couple of gems that are homegrown. You know, like David Frankel is a great storyteller, my old partner and my friend, and we've got a story about when we were all in the flea market. This is a classic. We keep reviving it in few years, because this is a homegrown kind of South African story. So we were sitting in the flea market in the late 80s into the early 90s, just before IS. I did about 7 years of weekends in the flea market, when originally there was only one flea market it wasn't called Newtown then, but whatever the equivalent was, by the Market Theatre.
Right. Okay.
And then the Bremer Market came a few years later, and the Rosebank B&B Market. But originally there was one market. And I was selling these ties and these T-shirts and baseball caps, and my brother and Dave Frankel was selling these picture frames and these spray paint aerosol things that they got from my mom's partner, my mom's not husband, no, like husband. My mother, my parents were divorced. They weren't married, but they were together for 30 years, and he sadly passed.
Right.
But and he was a wealthy trader, and he got this shipment from Taiwan of these aerosols. Couldn't send them back because it's too expensive to send them back. So he sold them to he's a trader. And he gave them to my brother and to David and said, look, sell whatever you want and let the boys have some fun, like on a consignment. So we were all sitting in the flea market one winter Saturday morning, and a lady came up to us. They were I had the ties, and in the stall next to me was David and my brother selling these aerosols and these picture frames. And a very official lady came like with a clipboard, writing stuff down on the clipboard,
yes.
and said to David, young man, do your aerosols have CFCs? Now, David didn't know what she was talking about. So he looked at me. I looked at my brother. My brother looked at Dave. Dave came up very close to it intimately because he's quite the salesman and quite confident. He was 17. We were driving my mother's Mazda without a license. Those were the days. And he leaned in closer to this woman and he said, lady, we are the market leaders. He said, we have more CFCs than any of our competitors. He says, I implore you to, what's the word, implore you to find anyone with more CFCs than us. Anyway, they confiscated all the stock. Yeah. They shut us down. The stuff is still in a warehouse if you want it. I don't know. It was confiscated for destroying the ozone. But we learned a lesson. He didn't know what it was. So it's a funny story. When I started, a lot of people said, what did you all bring to the party? No, what's the word? What did you bring to the table? And Dave Frankel actually brought a table. His mother had this traders table, and that was our first table. We sat there, we wrote our notes.
We brought a table to the table.
We brought a table, and that's a quick throwaway. But we've all got these stories, and I think as leaders, as CEOs, as leaders, managers, leaders. The ability to tell a story, the ability to get other people. It's not just about telling stories. It's about sharing stories as well. Otherwise, it becomes very one-sided because everyone in synthesis has a story.
So what's interesting as well, and as a writer, I often have this discussion with people. My own family says to me, or my wife will say to me, we were out together and I experienced exactly what you experienced. But I barely noticed or saw that, and you've come back and you've created this whole column around an incident or something that happened and what you understood by it and how that showcased whatever it is that I was writing on. And I don't really know what the answer is. Do you think that there are people that are more open?
Absolutely, it's a talent. It's definitely a talent. It's definitely a confidence. It's definitely nurtured. It's definitely, I think it's quite an entrepreneurial thing. I'll explain what I mean by that. Like, look at a photographer. If a photographer sees a moment, you've got to capture it. You've got to carpe diem, because if you miss it, you can't come back tomorrow. If I hear a story, if you share an anecdote with me, I write it down. I'm always writing. I scribble stuff on my phone, and then I document it, because if I miss the moment, you might not remember tomorrow what you were sharing with me. And it's quite entrepreneurial to always have like a pen and paper, to always capture that moment, to document things. And I think that's part of the talent and the discipline. There's a discipline in storytelling as well.
I think so, yeah.
So there's two parts to it, like what we touched on earlier. There's definitely the confidence, the ability, the sense of humor. I think humor has a lot to do with storytelling, because humor can make a simple story very engaging. And I'll give you an example of that. And it's a famous one that you'll know. And then the other thing is the person as well. the personality, because you can write up a story. I mean, that's the thing. Look at American politics right now. I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but he tells a better story than Joe Biden. You know, I mean, he is a bullshitter and a storyteller. I think a twisted, mad storyteller. I don't like him at all. But if you had to drop in from Mars and didn't know anything about Biden or Trump, nothing, you know, who would you vote for? You'd vote for Trump, because Biden puts you to sleep. He always says, here's the thing.
I can't even imagine. I cannot remember a thing that the man has said. And that's
nothing.
So
he keeps saying things like, so here's the deal. He always says, so the thing is, it's like this American strange.
Yeah, it's verbiage. It's not.
I don't know what it is. He's got these weird. I mean, Trump's a lunatic. He's an absolute lunatic. I find him like just unclassy. He's just a terrible guy. But he knows how to bullshit. Look, I don't like to bullshit. There's bullshit and there's bullshit. He's bullshit on the bad level. But if you came from another planet and didn't know anything about them and listened to this debate for 20 minutes, you'd vote for him, not Biden. Biden puts you to sleep. I don't think Biden can tell a story. Barack Obama could tell a story. Jesus, that guy was like an orator of note. He even used that word, orator. You don't even say it's like you graduate, you become an orator. Because like, storyteller is for you and me. He was an orator. He was like Shakespearean in his talent. He was really and Ronald Reagan was a storyteller with a sense of humor, like, you know, with a sense of humor. And if you go to YouTube and you type like Ronald Reagan political stories, you'll find collections of them.
Incredible.
And they are, you know, I'm in Kiev, and there's that famous story that he tells about the guy that you know, saved up for 20 years because you couldn't just buy a car in the Soviet Union. You'd have to be on a list, and you'd have to save up. And eventually, like they tell this man, Vladimir, your car is coming in 10 years' time. Your car will be here. Like, he's been saving, and he's made the cut. And they say, in 10 years' time, your car will be delivered. And he says, in the morning or the afternoon. And they say to him, what difference does it make? He said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning. And the story's a lot more drawn out. I don't want to waste too much time. That's how it was. And a lot of it is still alive today. I'm living, testing me. I've seen this old Soviet legacy when they tell you the plumber's coming in 5 years' time, because it's not a joke. It's not a joke. But he was a great storyteller. And there is that old famous story about A.B. Cohen, who is walking his Chihuahua in Brooklyn, and he walks past the synagogue on a Friday night, and he remembers that in that synagogue they have a hell of a service. And he wants to join the congregation and get like a free chocolate and some free wine, you know. But he's got the Chihuahua. You know how you know the story? It's a classic. So what is he do?
Classic Jewish story.
He acts, you know, he puts on his glass and he walks in like he's blind. You know, we're on a video podcast. Okay, I'm trying to act. I'm a good actor. He walks in, tap, tap, tap. And the rabbi comes out and says, can we help you? He says, yeah, I'm here to join the service. And the rabbi looks at him and says, but sir, this is a house of worship. You know, it's the house of the Lord. You can't bring a dog in here. He says, that's not a dog. That's my guide dog. And he says, but sir, it's a Chihuahua. And Abby goes, they gave me a Chihuahua. You know, it's chutzpah. And chutzpah is, I think, a big part about storytelling, because you also have to have the chutzpah to tell. There's a time and a place for everything. Like, don't go and tell a joke at a funeral. It's not a place for jokes, you know. So you also need to know when to tell the story, and that also is a talent. Because I've seen some people, as going back to the subjects, storytelling for CEOs. When you're retrenching people, which is a big theme in this kind of modern Corona chapter that we're all going through, don't go and tell them a Van der Merwe joke and say, oh, by the way, we're letting you go. It's just not funny. You know, they're not going to see the humor in it. You're letting people go and telling a joke. You know, I think it requires a great compassion and sensitivity. And like a funeral. Funeral's a perfect black and white example. Don't tell jokes.
But yet it doesn't need to be a joke, but a story there.
So you're quite right. Sorry, I'm mixing my. I'm getting mixed up. Please forgive me. But I was thinking of funny stories. But absolutely. But correct. But what I was trying to say is there's a time and a place for a story, and I've seen people totally mess up the timing, you know, and the delivery. So there's three things we've identified. One is the talent to kind of act on your confidence and tell that story. Like, you can tell about a simple thing that happened to you and turn it into a story. I did that the other day, explained to someone about Soviet culture. And I turned a 1-minute thing into a 10-minute story, and they were laughing because it's a funny story. But when I went through it, that minute was very frustrating. And I explained it in a funny way that they got the point. So the one is the ability to identify and turn it into story. Then the second thing is like the way you tell that story. And there's probably actually a few more things around it. Then the timing, and then also this discipline to capture those stories, write them down. I've got files and files, digital files, where I just email myself the stories and have them in folders: business stories, movie stories, entrepreneurial stories. I mean, Adrian Gore tells good stories. He's not the funniest man around, but he does have a hell of a sense of humor. Like, he doesn't come across very funny in his like public persona of storytelling, but if you had a dinner with him, he's very funny. Ivan Epstein, great storyteller. He's a bit wacky, like he changes subject every few seconds. He's got, he says he's got like bad ADD. He says, I'm worse, which I don't know if I buy that, but he's a great storyteller. And David Frankel is a great storyteller. Maybe it's a Jewish thing, because we're actually all talking about Jewish people.
Well, it's interesting that, because I think that in many cases, Jews have been raised on storytelling, and I started off with the example of the Bible, then I moved on to sort of fairy tales, this type of thing. But family folklore and family history is very much part of. I know that when I get together with my siblings, a lot of what we talk about are the stories of our past, and if my children are there, they are hearing those stories of my past, which is effectively their past. And so the tapestry is woven of this folklore, and of course some of the stories, I have a problem with, and it's quite interesting, is I get very skeptical around often rabbis and their stories, because they've got these wondrous, fantastic stories about miracles and all sorts of things that happen. And I'm a little bit skeptical, and I love a good story. But I went to Rabbi Beryl Wine, who happens to be a historian and brilliant storyteller, and fellow skeptic. And I said to him, Rabbi Wine, what is the, how do I treat those stories? Because I'm so disbelieving when I sit in synagogue and I hear some of these things. And he says, well, the best way to understand them is that not all the stories that you hear have happened yet. And I love that, because then you could kind of just accept it for what it is. So we do use stories, and they evolve over time. But I just want to go back. Effectively, what you're saying is is identifying the stories, documenting them, and remembering them, knowing when it's appropriate to use the right stories at the right time, and then using them effectively to create to get a point across, and to create an environment that people actually remember and resonate with.
And absolutely. And also to add, because that's a point we identified, also to nurture your talent to tell that story. Because I think the more you practice at it,
can anybody be a storyteller?
I think, that's a great question. It's like saying, can anybody do like a public speech? As Jerry Seinfeld once made a joke, most people would rather be lying in their casket than talking to doing like public speaking. People are so scared to death when it comes to public speaking. So maybe to you and me, how it comes more naturally. I believe anyone can do it, but I also know, because I've seen it in personal experience as a leader, when you say to someone, think of it in school, when the teacher says, you come up, Howard, you Ronnie, and talk. Some people would love it, and a lot of people would be terrified, So I think some people are scared of it.
There's a famous James Thurber quote, which I wanted to find whilst we were talking, because you were telling that story about that 1 minute that was actually quite unpleasant, but when you told the story, it was funny. James Thurber says that humor is emotional chaos remembered in tranquility.
So you need to text me that, because that's something to ponder. I mean, I understand the words, but it's It's quite.
It's emotional chaos.
I understand. Yeah.
So you were in a crazy state. You were dilly, you were mad, you were angry, you were sad. But when you are remembering it in a tranquil environment, then you could introduce humor to it. So it's emotional chaos remembered in tranquility. It always resonated for me, that phrase.
To go back to what you said, I mean, all those points are exactly right. And I've never actually sat and made a list of all the kind of components or parameters of storytelling. But let's also unpack why it's important. Because, you know, a big part of a leader's job, a CEO's job, is to motivate people to reach certain goals. And to do that, we need to engage people's emotions. And the key to the heart is story. It's not PowerPoint, you know. And there's two ways to persuade people. The first is using conventional rhetoric, you know, PowerPoint slides, data, you know, curves, graphs. And a lot of executives are trained in that, you know, and it usually involves PowerPoint and presentation materials. And they say, like, here's our company's challenge, and this is what we need to do to succeed. And they build their case around that with statistics and quotes from authorities and facts and data. But there's two problems with this. You know, the first is that, you know, people have their own set of authorities and benchmarks and statistics. And, you know, while you're trying to persuade them, they're arguing with you in their heads. They know, you know, they've got a different view. And the second, which is even more important, is even if you do convince them, you know, it's not good enough because you've only convinced them at an intellectual level, not at an emotional level. If, for example, how we say synthesis has to build, let's use COVID as an example. The whole world is kind of on this new journey, and it's stressful. And medicine and doctors have never been more appreciated and respected, and whatever the words are. But we need doctors more than ever. We need scientists and medical scientists to help us to get through this, cure it, vaccinate us from it, relieve us from the symptoms. You know, we need medical science and doctors more than ever. And synthesis might play a role in developing, maybe it already is, I don't know all the projects, but might play a role in developing medical software that helps the world get through the corona crisis. But one guy at synthesis might get up and say, we need to meet this goal of building the software so we can make 1 million rands and have 300,000 rand of profit and blah, blah, blah. And maybe that's enough to get everybody lined up and, you know, fired up on a bunch of numbers. But there's no emotional buy-in. But another person could get up and say, we need to write the software because, yes, we'll make some money, but we could save 10,000 lives this week, 20,000 the next week. We might save your mom, my mom, your 5 kids, your new baby. We might save the synthesis staff. We might actually relieve a lot of suffering people. And people go, yes, we're actually doing important work here. You know, it has a different buy-in as opposed to we need to meet these numbers so we can all get a Christmas bonus. You know, and the way that story is told, if you had a personal example, if someone in your family, Howard, was ill from corona and the synthesis software helped bring comfort, maybe it helped cure, you know, get through the problem, maybe it brought relief, that is a whole different buy-in. Buy-in is, oh, they bought our software, I made 100 rand because my brother was sick. You know, like, so what are you trying to say? You made money because my brother was sick and synthesis solved it with their software. That saving in money or that profit doesn't really make a difference. But the fact that my brother is now back on his feet because of synthesis is quite moving and quite beautiful. You know, it's quite inspiring.
Here's a thought, though. I agree 1,000% because what we do is we personalize it. And over the last couple of years, in fact, the last couple of decades, what we've seen from a media perspective and a news perspective is that news has become personalized and localized. So I know that when I lived in New York, it was quite foreign to me that a news station would say a kid fell off a jungle gym or outside a first-story building, crossing live to the emergency room and crossing live to there. And it became very, very personalized news. What that did was created a lot of anxiety, because now all of a sudden there's this perception that people are falling out of windows all over the show. But also then what it did was then even on a national, international level. So it started off there, but then all of a sudden the CNNs and the Foxes are taking the individual story, whether it's about a hurricane or whether it's about COVID, and telling that personal story, which is great. But what it does to some extent is it almost gives us an inability to look at things from 10,000 feet. We're now looking at it from very much on the ground, which is very valuable in some ways, but actually quite damaging in others. I would imagine, therefore, and I'd like your thoughts on it, that the CEO or the storyteller has got to be able to do both and almost have that flexibility. Your thoughts?
Well, I think we touched on it with your previous summary. You're quite right. I mean, the storyteller has to be listening. If I can just step back, because it's something I learned through my friends who do stand-up comedy. I actually did stand-up comedy for 18 months, long time ago, and I learned with Riyad Musa and John Fismus and David Cow and Kagiso Ladiga, who kind of all let me into their world. And the one thing, like the John Fismus used to say, is that comedians have to listen much more than they actually stand up on the stage doing their shtick, because they are reading the room all the time. And if something isn't working, it's like a magic trick. They have to change direction so seamlessly that the audience doesn't know that they've lost the audience. If a comedian can't do that, then they die on stage. And what's interesting, how the metaphors, is it metaphors? The words they use, it's life and death. You either killed it, I killed it, I killed it, I killed the room, or you died on stage. Look how big the words are. You didn't like do okay or I wobbled a bit. It's life and death when it comes to comedy. They say I died on stage or I killed it. That's how comedians talk all over the world. And it's very like, those words are extreme. And the one thing that John used to teach me, say, you know, you need to listen. You need to be listening with your eyes. You need to scan that room, and it's a talent. And it's hard to do it because you're nervous and you're sweating and there's these bright lights in your face. So going back to what you said, I'm just trying to give some insight from what I've learned, is that CEO needs to be listening. You know, needs to be scanning the room, needs to be very much in touch with his company or her company, with the culture, with the problems. If Howard's just had a death in the family and I stand up at the staff meeting and use Howard as an example in my story, probably not the smartest thing to do if Howard's kind of grieving, you know. Howard just wants to be quiet and tranquil, you know, in the chaos. You know, let someone else be the example. Howard doesn't want to come up on stage and start acting out, you know, some kind of charades thing. So the CEO has to be very much, or the leader has to be very much in tune, has to be sensitive, has to, I mean, it definitely is a talent. And it goes back to a question you raised earlier, you asked earlier, does everybody have the ability? I do believe it can be nurtured, but some people are better at it. Some people are very gifted, but then also some people are twisted. So you can get people, going back sadly to Donald Trump, that have a lot of charisma in his own raw, charming way. I mean, I don't really particularly like his brand of charisma, but he's like a twisted storyteller. And you do get people that you get these motivational speakers. I don't want to mention names because you know some of them in South Africa, but they've never done anything other than tell stories. So their gift is the storytelling, but it's not backed up by any substance. They just talk a bunch of shit. And it's very charming and engaging. But storytellers that tell stories based on experience and based on painful lesson learned, to me, are some of the most engaging storytellers. And that goes back to entrepreneurs. Because to me, one of the things I've always said, every entrepreneur has a lot of stories. Because what is entrepreneurship? It's a collection of stories. There's some losses, there's some successes, and if you put it all together, it becomes a big storytelling exercise, or a big storytelling collection, a collection of storytelling. Because that's what entrepreneurs go through. They go through one chapter after another. And some of the stories are joyous and some of them are very painful. And generally there's a lot of painful stories. And that's when we learn. We learn from those
because those are equally as important. It's not just the funny stories, is it? Yeah. It's the stories that really, you know, we had a conversation some weeks ago with Vusi Tembukwaya, and I don't know if if you follow his story at all, but when he speaks about and Amanda Dambuza, when you hear where she came from, the poverty, that she endured, and where she is today, it's so inspiring. We all want to be.
I was on that webinar and with that lady and her tough story, but she was very confident. Like, a lot of people are ashamed of their background, especially like here in like the old Soviet countries. They're very ashamed of their past. So some people can turn it into a compelling story that is engaging and sensitive, and you don't feel like, oh, they're manipulating me, and you kind of feel sorry for them. You actually go along on the ride, and yet while it's moving and you go, wow, you've really gone against such odds and you've lifted yourself up and you're amazed. A lot of people don't have that confidence to actually let you into their world, and feel like embarrassed and ashamed and humiliated. If I did a lot of charity work in South Africa for about a 10, 11 year period, up until about 10 years ago, when my life kind of changed a bit and I started spending time between Kiev and South Africa, and it got less involved in my activities back in South Africa. But one of the things I was exposed to in South Africa with our work in fundraising was the low self-esteem in the greater population. And it's very similar to what has unfolded here in Eastern Europe. You've got this incredible low self-esteem after hundreds and hundreds of years of being put down and of oppression, where people are genuinely like feel worthless. You ask a young person here, didn't your parents ask a 30-year-old here, didn't your parents encourage you to dream? And they'll say, what? My parents would be arrested for dreaming. Wow. That's what they had in the Soviet Union.
And I see a shift in South Africa, which I'm loving, is, and I'll use again Amanda as that example.
Amanda, that's her name, Amanda, yeah.
She drinks champagne every day and posts about it because she says, I'm going to celebrate my achievement and I'm going to celebrate life. And I believe that we're starting to see that in South Africa, where a lot of South Africans have come out of tremendous poverty and oppression. There's no other word for it.
Yeah.
And are starting to achieve and are now proud of it. And we're starting to see people posting on Twitter, whether it's a first car, whether it's a first house, and that fills me with such pride, because those are the stories that should be defining us as a nation. And if we're afraid of it, and it's quite interesting because, going back to even a biblical thing, there's this whole concept in Judaism is that, for example, that Abraham, who was our forefather, considered the first Jew effectively, he came from a family of idol worshippers. And we speak about that in the Bible. Why do we do that? Because it's important to know our stories and where we come from. We're not ashamed of that. Everything in life is progression, and we've got to embrace the stories even with that. That's what makes the story so much more powerful, are those contrasts.
Correct.
And it's about having the confidence to be able to do that. We are unfortunately out of time. So Ronnie, I want to ask you, you're a storyteller, you're in film, you rightly say that is what Synthesis is doing, what companies do very often is actually creativity. What's your one message that you'll say to somebody who's watching this and is thinking, I want to be a storyteller? How do I start this journey?
I think you need a pen and paper. Like we said earlier, you need to start writing. Doesn't mean you have to be a writer. Like I'm Shakespeare, but write things down, capture all those stories. I'm pretty sure we could find, if we spent the time, a lot of people, sadly, like Amanda, that have similar difficult backgrounds with, tough life circumstances. And Amanda had the confidence, and somewhere along the line, she also had some luck. So something happened to Amanda that changed her fortune, and maybe it was the confidence that actually fed the luck. But we could find people in the same situation that are ashamed to tell those stories. So Amanda was a fortunate person who, I think maybe is safe to say, draws strength from her stories and uses her journey in life as a source of inspiration and strength. It feeds her character. Whereas other people might not be as blessed and see it as something that they should be ashamed about. So how does one become a storyteller like Amanda, like anybody?
Start writing it down.
Writing it down. Start sharing your stories with people that you trust, and see if they take to those stories. I think I became a storyteller through my IS journey, where I used to go out and present. And as I would find a rapport with an audience, I would build up my confidence. I think practice makes...
In other words, yeah, practice, be real with yourself.
And go out there and express yourself to people close to you. Learn to build up that confidence. So I learned it by, jumping in. I was put in the ring and said box, and a couple of times I failed, and then you get better at it. And I started to enjoy it, and I look forward to the challenge of a bigger audience, a new audience, a foreign country. I've done talks here in Kiev, and I died. I hated it. I died. I couldn't get out of bed for a week, thinking, yes, I was useless. And this is for a guy that has been around the block, and I'm considered to be a successful entrepreneur. And I was hard on myself, and I said, yes, I did not enjoy that. And I died. I didn't know my audience. That's another key point. You got to know your audience. I did not know my audience. I was well prepared, but I was overconfident, and I didn't do enough homework on who's this audience. I was told they speak English. Not exactly true. 80% spoke English. So 20% looked like they didn't know what I was talking about. And while I can speak a bit of Russian, it's not so easy to make them laugh in like broken Russian. You need to have command of the language. And then there's another problem that I discovered, a technical problem, is they had these translators in the back. There was a 300-seater auditorium in the Hilton. Well, they're translating, and I'm hearing this mumbling in the back of the room, and I'm going, wow, someone is bored and is talking over me. So I'd stop, and then they would stop. It was like a murder mystery story. And I would talk about it, then I'd hear the mumbling. And eventually, after 10 minutes, I actually said, sorry, guys, I'm hearing people talking. I actually stopped the talk because it made me so uncomfortable. And then somebody said, I could see I was dying there. I said, no, it's translators. And I thought, oh, I'm in trouble. I've got 45 minutes left. And I keep hearing, it's very like almost disrespectful, but it wasn't meant to be. It's just, and I said, next time I can't do this, because you can't have people translating on the fly while you're talking. I'm going, I can hear people talking, and it's like, it's very unsettling. So you need to know your audience, so I gave 2 talks in Kiev, and I said, the next time I do that, I'm going to do a lot of homework. So you need to know your audience. That's for sure as well. But the only way to learn storytelling is to go out and tell stories.
Do it. Be confident.
And build up that confidence, and celebrate your struggle in life. And a lot of people don't. It comes from low self-esteem, and I don't know what the answer is to that. Sometimes you need, like in that movie Good Will Hunting, you need someone to believe in you. Maybe someone believed in Amanda, and that built up her confidence. That could be the luck. Maybe somebody took a chance and said, "Well, I'm gonna invest my time in this person." You choosing to give me this platform boosts my confidence. Not that I'm an unconfident guy, but you've actually done me a bit of a mitzvah, because I'm a bit out of touch. I haven't done much public speaking this year because of Corona. I'm far away from everything that I really know and familiar with. My corporate network is largely in South Africa, and giving talks to people in Ukraine is challenging, as I mentioned. And your platform this morning is fun, and you're a warm, engaging person, but it does boost my confidence. Unfortunately, you can't put every single South African on your show because there's not enough time, But sometimes just giving someone that platform, giving someone friendship, is the luck that they need. Like in Good Will Hunting, someone believed in Will Hunting, and that boosted his confidence, And it can be that small little thing. Just we take it for granted, but being kind to someone, giving them your time and your trust, can help boost someone's confidence and nurture a storyteller. So there's maybe a message for all of us who might be listening, is just give the time and compassion to someone and listen to their story and encourage them. And if they've got a story, say, that's actually a beautiful story, as heartbreaking as it is. Look at the humor in it. Look at what you've gone against, those odds, what you've managed to do. Look where you are now. Let's encourage people to be proud of history and their journey, not to be ashamed. Because if I look at the low self-esteem that I was exposed to in South Africa in my decade of fundraising, and here in the old Soviet countries, everyone's very ashamed. And to tell stories here is it's not common, because people are
Maybe that's your job, is to try and to get people to tell their stories.
but yours more than mine, because you've even got a platform for it. You know,
it is true, but none in Kiev. Ronnie, you need to leave it there. Unfortunately, a fascinating conversation. I loved it. I can carry on doing this for hours. Storytelling is what is such a valuable and important quality, and we do need to practice it. We need to work on it, and we need to encourage people to tell their stories. I'm Howard Feldman. I'm head of marketing and people at Synthesis Software Technologies. Thank you for joining us. Ronnie Apteker, thank you for your time.
Thanks. Thank you very much.